So this is also called the citric acid cycle. Some people call it that, or the Krebs cycle. Krebs was, I believe, a German scientist that first described this. So again, you've got the initial metabolic pathways, okay, giving you the raw materials for the common metabolic pathway. We already talked about this. Bread breaks down to glucose, fruit breaks down to fructose, so on and so forth. And then those enter the common pathway, which is Krebs. And that's because those are broken down into a couple of usable molecules like pyruvate, which then combines with oxaloacetate and forms acetyl-CoA. But we're not going to get too much into that. Pyruvate enters the mitochondrial chains and then the electron transport chain. So from one molecule of glucose, you'll effectively get, and this is debatable, some people say 26, some say 32. I've read a couple places even higher. Somewhere between 20 and 30 to 32 will say molecules of ATP. So massively efficient. So this is your oxidative phosphorylation. And meanwhile, you're creating free radicals. So we've got to figure out how to neutralize that, and we're going to talk about it. So glucose is broken down to acetate, joins citrate in the Krebs cycle. Each molecule of acetate will produce 2 carbon molecules through this circle of chemical reactions. So at the end of the day, the Krebs cycle makes 2 molecules of carbon dioxide, carbon C, O2 is oxygen, and there's 2 of them, so carbon dioxide, and it passes the electrons. It's derived from these food molecules, so it pulls the energy out in the form of electrons and then passes that to the electron transport chain. So think of the Krebs cycle as like you've refined your crude into oil. So now you've got light crude and heavy crude, and now we can move on to the refining process. And here we are. So the bottom right picture is your mitochondria. And if you've watched other lectures I've given, the mitochondria is the true source of all things good and bad in the body. It is the powerhouse and the engine of all your cells. So your cell makes energy in the mitochondria just like your car makes energy in the engine, right? So it does this by way of the electron transport chain, which sits in the membrane, okay? And then, again, it's the only purpose of this electron transport chain is to push protons onto one side of the membrane so that they then want to naturally fall to the other side to even it out. And that's how you create the energy. So think of it like a turbine. ATPase is like a turbine, like wind pushes the blades of an air turbine or the turbine in a jet engine. So that's how you're getting your motion and your energy. And so the Krebs cycle places 2 electrons on NAD, which is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. And you may have seen ads for supplements of NAD and all that. And this is the whole point of it. NAD is really just it's a way to transfer electrons into the electron transport chain, so ultimately they can end up on oxygen and form water. Water is a waste product in our body. That's why we urinate. So the whole purpose of this is really just to move electrons around so that we could get a proton gradient to go through our pump to make ATP. So what we'll do in this system is we'll actually reduce NAD to NADH and we reduce FAD to FADH. All that means is we're putting some electrons on it so that it can then pass electrons to the electron transport chain. So hopefully this has made sense. So you eat bread, it becomes glucose. The glucose gets broken down, put into the citrate cycle or the Krebs cycle. It spins around a series of chemical reactions, and ultimately all that happens there is the energy from the glucose is put onto these molecules, NAD, FAD, and then also GDP, which then go to the electron transport chain and provide electrons to feed the refinery. So again, this just reviews that. So the Krebs cycle is central in the mitochondria. You've got the inner membrane, you've got the matrix. So the Krebs cycle sits in the matrix, spitting out these NADH molecules, FADH. Those go to the electron transport chain, which is in the membrane, makes a proton gradient, okay? So you're then all of a sudden you got one side of this membrane that's super high in protons, positive charge. One side of the membrane that's super low in protons, negative charge. And then there's only one way to get through, and that's through ATPase, and that's how we make energy.